A pleasure to meet all at last. And we have a third and pretty much final installment to the likes of House of the Dead. As I said before, I probably won't go much further on the House of the Dead series because, unfortunate as it might sound, the House of the Dead Part 3, which came out in June 2002, it's fair to say that they've had a good way to spread it apart based on how much time it passes between each installment. The first came out in 96, the second came out in 99, and the third came out in 2002. And this is mostly regarding to console releases, which I'm more familiar with. Sometimes the arcade versions would come out a little while before the game would come out on consoles, and sometimes the console versions would come out almost at the same time as the arcade versions. With this, they were able to do just that. They were able to get the arcades up and around, but then have it ported to consoles. It's safe to say, though, that in terms of storyline and in terms of a few other things, Part 3 doesn't come off as awesome as with the other games. No, the thing is that in terms of what it is, it's the same old sort of thing that we saw before with the light gun shooter capabilities, but on consoles, like when I played it on the Xbox 2001, the version in particular did allow for a couple of unique options, such as turning the blood from red to green, and it also allowed for some ragdoll physics, which I thought those were some pretty unique options that you can pick from the menus. But Part 3's storyline, while it does typically follow in continuity just like what the other two did, the main thing about the plot is that it, believe it or not, takes place deep into the future. 2019. Wow. Just think. I'm a bit belated on that part, but that's still pretty impressive because more than 20 years had passed by the time the Curien Mansion incident took place, which is described as the in-universe fictional apocalyptic scenario that upstarted the zombie apocalypse and forced the agents of ANS from the likes of G and Thomas Rogan to essentially take on the threat themselves. Not only of the undead, but also from Dr. Curien himself. And while he was formidable in manifesting the likes of a magician and with the help of a businessman, a certain crystal-like creature, how does Part 3 come out? Well, many years since the events of the second game took place, in the year 2019, there's essentially a few things that go on with former AMS agent Thomas Rogan, because by then he has retired from his role. A certain research facility of the EFI, once owned by Dr. Curien, is infiltrated in terms of how is it running at the moment. Because after all, even though Dr. Curien, by this point, had supposedly gone rogue, there were still problems going on. And well, its connection to the current state of Earth as it stands many years after the apocalypse began, well, there unfortunately do come some problems. This is essentially a prologue in which that Thomas Rogan, along with another agent known as Captain Dan Taylor, both unfortunately end up in a laboratory after shooting through large groups of enemies. This prologue does unfortunately end with the death. Yeah. We once again have another tarot card reference. Death, of course, is a reference to a giant zombie security guard, whom we'll definitely talk a bit more about later, because he actually becomes more important later on in the plot. The thing is, Taylor and Rogan unfortunately get attacked, and while Taylor unfortunately gets killed, Rogan unfortunately is cut off from communication. So, what they have to do is that after a little while passes, by Halloween of 2019, oh man, just think, it was around that time when you know what started. But there are in fact some flashbacks that we get to see before we reach a more recent matter that takes place. The thing is that it shows us the supposed origin of how Curien was motivated overall of studying the likes of life and death, resulting in the original Curien Mansion outbreak in 1998. 21 years in the past now. And while the main method of this so-called research was actually meant as a means to help his son Daniel, it unfortunately doesn't quite do so well here, because in the same way as what we'd seen before when, if you might remember, Resident Evil 2 had a similar sort of thing go on. House of the Dead 3 essentially insinuates that the plot of the franchise itself almost was like a direct copy to what the Resident Evil games were like over the years. In Resident Evil 2, there was the likes of, well, the doctor, and he had a wife and daughter, but unfortunately, throughout what happened there, he had manifested in something known as the T-virus. In the remakes, it's referred to as the G-virus. I can't quite be sure why that was implemented, nor could I find out why that would make sense. And with House of the Dead 3, we sort of get a similar sort of thing. Curien has a son of his own, not really a daughter, but it still is the same sort of matter here. This so-called mutation and this special cure to this terminal illness, unfortunately, wouldn't go so well here because further research was put in to develop the mutation, believing that Curien could actually change the world. Well, what happens is that we happen to get the likes of Lisa and G. And while fights take place, and throughout most of the game, we essentially get to see the two of them shoot their way through into that same laboratory. And while the events also allowed for the death to be encountered multiple times, at first outside the building, but then deep into a corridor, we essentially get to fight the death many times. I mean, this is a massive security guard brute whom is attacking the two. It's also by this point that you get to notice a couple of things that were technically wrong with the game. The voice acting was rather cheap, and in fact a lot of things about this title felt pretty cheap from the get-go. Some of the game's graphics, apart from the voice acting, also feel in a way that they didn't have that much time put together to make this something that would actually be worthwhile. But of course, I actually made it to the end, which overall took me around an hour to get to, and in that sense, there were a number of levels that we went through. Apart from the prologue, where the likes of Thomas and Dan had infiltrated the lab, and then with Lisa and G following behind after some time since communication was lost, there were a number of boss battles that also took place here and there, like a giant star-nosed mole that would climb up on the wall as the likes of our characters would descend down into the underground lab. But for the most part, we face off against death. This security guard certainly doesn't mess around, and he takes a lot of abuse. In spite of the many shots from our shotguns, he definitely takes a lot of bullets. No doubt about it. But the real big trigger here is the fact that even in the year 2019, they were actually able to get to the very end, in which that while they were able to get down to the likes of, well, what had happened, we basically get to see what goes on with Daniel. Daniel, of course, was actually responsible for tending to the likes of Rogan. Rogan, after all, was injured and cut off from communication, but Daniel somehow found him and took him in. And by the end of the game, we essentially have something known as the Wheel of Fate. This is yet another tarot card here. Yeah. It's clear to think that they got all their ideas from the likes of tarot cards, of all things they could have done here. I mean, I wouldn't be too surprised if they had a full Resident Evil related thing or House of the Dead thing in which that every enemy was named after parts of the chakra structure. Or something of the sort, really. But, of course, as we probably know by now, the end of the game does come not only with one massive battle against the likes of Curien. Well, Dr. Curien apparently was, well, resurrected. Following his death by the magician in the first game, what we got here is a Curien that is even more powerful. And not only was the Wheel of Fate pretty much a formidable enemy here, but this resurrection of Curien does in fact allow for, well, not only him and the Wheel of Fate to make for quite the duo to fight against, but trust me, this kind of boss battle, while it's the same old sort of thing that we'd seen before, it's nothing all too special, unfortunately. All this really is just a big setup for a future scenario where Kyrian somehow gets brought back to life by the magic of the magician, and combined with the power of the Wheel of Fate, of course it's going to be a pretty intense boss battle. But for a part 3, the cheapness and other things about it, and the monotony factor coming from the fact that this is a rail shooter, while there are cutscenes here and there, they can break up the monotony in some ways and also elaborate on the story that unfolds. Well, safe to say that Part 3 unfortunately did not perform nearly as good as what we saw with the other 2 games. While it did okay on the basis of telling the story and giving us the final push to allow for Dr. Kyrian to fully be defeated for good in this instance, the kind of trilogy feel seemingly does give us a similar sort of vibe as what we have had with other franchises. You remember how Star Wars has had 3 trilogies? And this was about 40 years worth of time that had come and gone. With other franchises, trilogies seem to be a common placement, though sometimes they go beyond that level. And I'm sure that with The Incredibles, there could be a part 3 on the rise. But I can't be too sure of that because some people have had some bad takes on the second Incredibles film compared to what they were able to see from the first one. The first one had a pretty dark nature to it, and the second one barely held up to the same old expectations as people had with the first. But they're both fantastic films, so I would be more than willing to have a part 3 in it. In that same regard, lots of people are talking about sequels with other franchises. Toy Story 5, especially knowing the fact that 4 was rather successful, critically and financially speaking. Anyways though, with House of the Dead Part 3, I've had a lot more memories of this game because I did have an Xbox 2001, and more so, I had this game itself, for a few years at least. Having only played it a few times, it was rather challenging, in some ways that you might imagine. And I also will say that while most people will agree that the third game does not go nearly as well as the other 2 did, it still is a necessary component. It's set in the future, something in which that some segments of a franchise are known to take place in. Even more so, with a game that happens to not only take place in the future, which is now the past, I'd say we got ourselves quite a story here to tell. Something I feel like that was a bit overdue, but it still works nonetheless. For my overall scoring of House of the Dead 3, we're going to simply leave it at around a 7.0 out of 10.1. Somewhat medial, but it simply is the standard of which that I normally operate based on scoring of whatever media I'm known to talk about. And with that in mind, this conclusifies another week of video games that are totally awesome, and while I won't really talk much about Dead Island or House of the Dead anymore, I at least covered the main basis in which these franchises were rooted upon. And with other rootings that I might as well cover, stay tuned for next week where I will begin a new week worth of talking about video games.